The Arctic swallowed them whole that night. A battle-worn veteran named James Harland, his slightly long, curly silver-grey hair tangled by the wind, and his loyal golden retriever Max trudging beside him through the blinding storm. The world vanished into white, and soon so did they, buried beneath the rage of the northern blizzard. For a year, no one spoke their names. The rescue teams had long stopped searching, believing the cold had claimed them both. But one pale morning, exactly 12 months later, a helicopter crew spotted something impossible. A faint spiral of smoke rising from a snow-buried cabin deep in the Arctic wilderness. When they landed, the cabin door creaked open as if expecting them, warm air spilling out into the frozen air, carrying the scent of burning pine wood and something else. The feeling that someone had just been there. Inside, the fire still crackled. The bed was made, and by the hearth, a golden hair lay glinting in the light. It was the color of Max's fur. What the team discovered that day would forever change how they understood loyalty, survival, and the bond between a man and his dog that even the coldest storm on Earth could not destroy. The day before the storm swallowed them, the veteran James Harland had awakened early. His slightly long, curly, silver-grey hair already tousled by the cold wind that slipped through the cracks of the cabin walls. The Arctic morning stretched endlessly white beyond the window, and his breath fogged the frosted glass as he looked out toward the ridgeline where the sun barely rose above the horizon. The cabin was small, built from rough timber decades ago, yet every inch of it carried his touch. The stove polished clean, the boots lined neatly by the door, and a single photograph pinned above the table showing him in uniform with his golden retriever Max beside a younger version of himself. Max, now older and calmer, stirred on the rug near the fire, his golden coat shimmering softly in the orange glow, tail twitching at the smell of the coffee pot bubbling on the stove. James reached down, rubbing the dog's ear, feeling that same pulse of companionship that had kept him alive through wars, through nights when men screamed and froze, and through years of solitude that followed. He had come north to study the migration of Arctic foxes, or at least that was the story he told anyone who asked. Truthfully, he came here to be left alone. A man trying to make peace with the noise in his head that never quieted since the service. Outside, the world looked deceptively calm. The snow crust gleamed like glass, and the ice on the lake shone beneath the pale morning sun. Yet James knew the patterns of the wind better than anyone. The sky had turned the wrong shade of grey, the kind that swallowed the horizon before a storm broke loose. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to feel the hum of incoming artillery before it struck. "We might need to pack up, boy," he murmured, pouring the last of the coffee into a tin cup. Max lifted his head, ears perked, eyes full of unspoken understanding. That was the thing about dogs like him. They didn't need words to know what was coming. The first flake drifted past the window by noon, lazy and harmless. By afternoon, the wind screamed against the door, clawing at the walls like something alive. James worked quickly, securing the shutters, stacking firewood near the hearth, checking the fuel for the generator. Max stayed close, pacing between the table and the door, letting out low, uneasy whines. When the radio crackled with static, James tried to reach base camp. Nothing but noise. He stared at the coordinates scribbled in his logbook, realizing they were too far from any safe zone. The storm wasn't just passing through, it was collapsing around them. As night fell, the cabin trembled. The roof moaned under the weight of snow, and the window panes rattled as if ghosts were pressing their hands against them. James wrapped himself in his military jacket, the same one he had worn during his last deployment, and knelt beside the fire, whispering, "We'll be fine, Max. Just like old times." The dog pressed his head into James's lap, trembling slightly but staying close. The flames cast flickering shapes on the log walls, memories of comrades, of frozen nights in trenches, of faces he couldn't save. Outside, the storm howled louder, the sound merging with the beating of his own heart. For a moment, he imagined he heard voices calling his name in the wind, but when he opened the door to look, There was only a wall of white. Snow surged into the room, biting at his face, freezing his breath mid-air. He slammed it shut and leaned back, chest heaving, as the wind howled to be let in. In the corner, Max barked once, sharp and urgent, staring at the door as though someone stood on the other side. James followed the dog's gaze, his scar catching the light of the fire. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though even he didn't believe his own voice. Beyond the door, something shifted, faint and heavy, and the firelight flickered as if in reply. The storm had only just begun. The storm had howled for 2 nights without rest, and by the 3rd day, the world outside no longer existed. Only the sound of the wind clawing at the cabin walls like an animal that refused to die. Inside, James Harland sat near the hearth, his slightly long curly silver-grey hair matted with sweat and frost, his scar faintly glowing under the firelight, his olive military jacket stiff from dampness, and his gloves drying beside the flames. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin, and his breath rose like ghosts in the dim light. Max, his golden retriever with a white patch on his chest and one bent ear, lay stretched near the fire, golden fur flickering orange, his brown eyes fixed on the door as if listening to something only he could hear. The storm outside screamed like 1,000 memories from a war James could never forget. Voices of men calling through the snow, radio static whispering coordinates that led to nowhere. He rubbed his temples, trying to push the past away, but the howling wind made it come alive again. The night his unit had been lost in the mountains, the same white walls of wind swallowing every sound, until he heard only his heartbeat and the panting of his dog. He reached down and touched Max's head, feeling that old steady comfort beneath his palm. "You and me again, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "We always make it out." The flames crackled softly, the only heartbeat left in a frozen world. When the generator coughed and sputtered, the light flickered, shadows crawling over the cabin walls like something alive. James rose slowly, knees aching, and moved to check the fuel line. The cold bit through his jacket instantly. Frost gathered on his beard. Max followed, tail low, body tense, eyes tracking every sound. A wooden beam groaned above them, snow sliding off the roof with a thud that made the dog jump. "Easy," James whispered, tightening his grip on the flashlight. The beam cut through the cabin's interior, shelves lined with tins, a cot with a wool blanket, a single metal cross nailed above the window. He had nailed it there years ago, though he hadn't prayed since the war. But that night, with the wind clawing at the door, he found himself staring at it, whispering a quiet plea into the dark. The radio crackled suddenly. A faint voice, broken and fading. "Station, visibility, can't." James lunged toward it, twisting the dial, heart pounding. The static hissed and then died. No, come on," he muttered, smacking the side of the old metal box. Silence. Then, faintly, if anyone can hear this, blizzard, Northern Ridge. The voice vanished again. He looked at Max. The dog's ears lifted, body frozen, eyes bright. James felt something stir inside him. That old soldier's instinct that never quite faded. Someone was out there. He grabbed his jacket, zipped it tight, and slung his pack over his shoulder. Max was already at the door, waiting, nose pressed against the wood. "Not yet," James said, his breath clouding the air. "Not till the wind breaks." But the wind didn't break. It only grew wilder, as if warning him to stay inside. Hours passed. The fire sank low, embers pulsing like dying hearts. James drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, the storm's roar blending with dreams of searchlights, distant gunfire, and the cries of wounded men. When he awoke, the light filtering through the window was blue, the world outside buried deeper than before. He rose, bones stiff, and stepped to the window. The horizon was gone. Only a white void remained. Then he saw it, faint, almost imagined, a dark shape moving in the distance. He blinked, rubbed the frost from the glass, and looked again. Nothing. But Max was already standing, tail rigid, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "What is it, boy?" James whispered, hand finding the cold handle of his hunting knife. Max stepped toward the door, sniffing, whining softly. Something shifted outside. Snow crunching, slow and deliberate. James's heart thudded. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. The wind screamed again, shaking the cabin to its bones, and for a moment it sounded almost human, a voice calling his name through the storm. "James! Harland!" He froze. Max barked once, sharp and warning. The fire flared, a gust rushing down the chimney. He turned toward the door, pulse hammering in his ears. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the threshold. For a long moment, James Harland stood frozen by the door, his hand gripping the handle, his heart pounding louder than the wind that battered the cabin walls. His slightly long, curly, silver-grey hair brushed against his cheek, damp with sweat and frost, his scarf faintly catching the light of the fire that struggled to stay alive. The sound outside was deliberate. Too steady to be the wind, too heavy to be snow shifting. Max, his golden retriever with the white chest patch and bent right ear, stood rigid at his side, golden fur bristling, a low growl vibrating from his chest. "Easy, boy," James whispered, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. He reached for his rifle, sliding it off the wall hook, the metal cold against his palm. Then he waited. Another thud came, closer this time, followed by silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. He eased the latch open just enough to peer through the crack. A swirl of white light burst through, blinding him for a second. Snow whipped into the room, stinging his face. When his eyes adjusted, he saw something dark, half buried near the porch, a shape moving weakly against the wind. Without thinking, he shoved the door open and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit like a hammer, seizing his lungs, but he forced himself forward, boots sinking deep into snow that rose to his knees. "Hello?" he shouted. But the wind stole the word before it reached the air. Max bounded beside him, barking into the blinding white. The figure moved again, a hand reaching up through the snowdrift. James dropped to his knees, brushing away the snow until he uncovered the frozen face of a man. The stranger's lips were blue, eyes half open, skin pale as the snow itself. A rescue patch on his jacket sleeve caught the light. One of the newer units, probably from the outpost 50 miles east. "Hang on," James muttered, slipping his arms under the man's shoulders. He was light, too light, the kind of weight that told a story of days without food. Max pressed close, barking into the wind as if to guide them back. Step by step, they dragged the man into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind them. The heat inside felt almost violent after the cold. James lowered the stranger onto the floor near the fire, unzipping his frozen parka and rubbing warmth into his arms. The man's eyes fluttered. "You're alive," he whispered weakly, voice hoarse. James blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "What do you mean?" The man coughed, lips trembling. "They said no one could have survived out here, not for this long." His gaze flicked toward Max, who sat beside the fire, tail twitching, golden fur glowing in the light. How did you keep the heat?" James frowned. "I kept the fire going, same as anyone would." But the man shook his head faintly. "The storms out here, they kill everything, even the wood freezes solid." James felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He turned toward the fire, its flames steady and strong, despite the lack of fresh logs for almost a day. He hadn't thought about it until now. He'd run out of kindling last night, and yet the fire hadn't died. He glanced at Max, who met his gaze with calm, steady eyes. The stranger's breathing slowed. "They said we'd find only ashes," he whispered, before falling unconscious. James stared at him, the wind howling faintly outside as if laughing at the words. He stood slowly, rubbing a hand through his tangled curly hair, his scar throbbing under the skin. The air inside felt heavier now, alive somehow, like the storm had followed them indoors. Max rose, ears flicking, eyes darting toward the corner near the hearth. James followed the dog's gaze, and for the briefest moment he saw it too. A figure, faint, white as mist, standing by the fire, its outline shaped like a man in uniform, motionless, watching them both. Then it was gone. The flames crackled louder. James backed away, pulse hammering, whispering under his breath, "Not again." Max moved closer, pressing his head into James's hand, grounding him in the real world. "We're all right, boy," James murmured, though his voice trembled. Outside, the daylight dimmed behind the swirling snow, and the wind carried a voice that sounded hauntingly familiar. Calm, low and distant, calling his name just once more. James. The next morning, James Harland woke to silence, the first true quiet he had heard in weeks. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried beneath a white ocean of snow that glowed like glass under the pale sun. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, steady and strong, though no one had fed it in hours. James sat up slowly, his slightly long, curly, silver-grey hair falling across his forehead, frost clinging to the ends. His scar caught the morning light that streamed through the frosted window. For a moment, he simply watched the fire, his breath fogging the air, his olive military jacket stiff and cold against his skin. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath. Max, his golden retriever with the white patch on his chest and bent right ear, stood by the hearth, tail wagging gently, golden fur shimmering in the light. The rescued man still lay where James had placed him, wrapped in blankets, pale but breathing. James leaned forward, his boots creaking against the wood, and stirred the fire with a metal rod. The embers flared, too bright for such little fuel. He reached out to touch a log. It was warm to the core, almost alive. His fingers pulled back instinctively, the hairs on his arms standing up. "How long has it been burning, boy?" he said softly. Max tilted his head, ears flicking. Outside, sunlight shimmered over the snow, dazzling, endless. James stepped to the window, his gloved hand brushing away frost, and stared out at the Arctic wilderness. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. No wind, no movement, only the occasional sparkle where the sun touched an ice ridge. Then, faintly, he saw something, a trail of footprints leading away from the cabin. His breath caught. They weren't his. He turned sharply toward the sleeping man. The stranger's eyes were open. "You shouldn't be alive," the man whispered weakly. "You shouldn't either." James crouched beside him. "What do you mean?" The man's cracked lips moved slowly. "We came looking for the Harland cabin. They said no one survived here, that the fire never went out." His gaze flicked to Max, who sat watching silently, head slightly lowered, as though understanding every word. "We followed the smoke," the man said, "but by the time we reached the ridge, no tracks, no sound, just heat, coming from under the snow." James stared at him, pulse tightening. "You're saying you found warmth in the middle of a frozen wasteland?" The man nodded weakly. "You've been gone a year," he murmured. "Your team gave up months ago." James froze. The cabin creaked softly, as though exhaling. He felt dizzy, the air growing thick. His scar pulsed faintly. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I was here. I was keeping the fire." The man's eyes closed again, exhaustion overtaking him. Max let out a low, uneasy whine and stepped closer to James. He reached down, resting his gloved hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in that steady warmth. The fire crackled behind them, a sound too steady, too alive. Then James heard it, a faint knock beneath the floorboards. He turned slowly. Another knock, 3 times, slow, deliberate. The hair on his neck rose. He grabbed the lantern and crouched near the edge of the rug, pulling it aside to reveal the old trapdoor he hadn't opened in months. Max stood beside him, fur bristling, tail stiff. James lifted the handle. It groaned, cold metal creaking. A rush of warm air flowed up from below. Not cold, warm. He aimed the lantern down the wooden steps leading into darkness. "Stay here, boy," he whispered, though he knew Max wouldn't. He climbed down slowly, boots echoing on old timber. The air below smelled like earth and smoke, ancient and alive. The flickering lantern light revealed stone walls, old crates, and something that made his blood freeze. Another fire, burning in a pit at the center of the room, untouched, its flames bright blue, not orange. He stood still, heart hammering. The fire didn't give off smoke or heat, but the light was beautiful and wrong all at once. Max came down behind him, barking softly. "What is this?" James whispered, stepping closer. His scar throbbed again, and for a moment he thought he heard voices in the flame. Faint, echoing, calling from somewhere deep beneath the ice. He backed away, hand trembling. Above them, the cabin creaked again, and the unconscious man groaned as though answering some distant signal. James looked at Max, who stood still, eyes fixed on the blue fire, tail lowered. "We shouldn't be here," James said softly. But the flame flickered once, and the whisper came again, clearer this time, from within the pit. It spoke his name. For a moment, James Harland simply stood there, staring at the strange blue fire that burned without smoke, its light rippling across the stone walls like water under glass. His slightly long, curly, silver-grey hair shimmered faintly in the glow, and the scar across his left eyebrow looked like a pale white cut carved by time itself. The air around him felt wrong, warm yet cold, alive yet silent. Max, his loyal golden retriever with golden fur and a white patch on his chest, stood motionless beside him, ears flattened, one bent ear twitching nervously. The soft blue light reflected in the dog's brown eyes made them look almost human. "What are you?" James whispered, his voice barely carrying. The fire pulsed gently, as if breathing. Then came the sound, soft, distant, echoing through the chamber like a memory of wind trapped under ice. He raised the lantern higher, its orange glow swallowed instantly by the blue radiance. The whisper came again, this time unmistakable. A man's voice, low and calm, speaking his name. "James Harland." His heart stopped. The voice was familiar. It carried the rhythm of command, the tone of a comrade long dead. "Who's there?" he shouted, his own echo chasing him across the walls. The flames shifted, flickering like a heartbeat, and then he saw it. Within the blue glow, faint shapes formed. Silhouettes of men in cold weather uniforms, standing at attention, their outlines made of light and ash. He stumbled backward, boots scraping the floor. "No," he muttered, shaking his head, breath trembling. "You're not real." Max stepped closer, growling low, but not in anger, in recognition. One of the figures raised a hand in a slow salute. The whisper grew clearer now, carried through the fire like air through a trumpet. "You kept the fire, soldier," it said. "You didn't let it die." James's throat tightened. His knees gave way, and he fell to the cold stone floor, staring into the impossible light. He remembered that night, the ambush, the freezing snow, the way his men had vanished one by one. He had lit a signal fire for rescue, but the storm never cleared. He'd always believed he alone survived. But what if that fire, that desperate act of hope, had tied him here somehow, anchored him to a promise that refused to end? "I never left," he whispered, voice breaking. The figures wavered, fading in and out like smoke. "We know," the voice replied gently. "Neither did we." The blue fire flared brighter, and suddenly the walls filled with the sound of wind again. But this time, it was calm, almost like breath. James closed his eyes, tears freezing at the corners, and reached toward the light. But Max barked sharply, breaking the trance. The blue flames flickered and dimmed. The dog stood in front of him now, blocking the light, tail stiff, eyes wide. "All right, boy," James murmured, steadying himself. "We're leaving." He turned toward the stairs, but a final whisper followed him. Soft, almost tender. The fire keeps you. When he climbed back into the cabin, daylight struck his eyes so sharply it felt like waking from a dream. The rescued man was sitting upright now, pale but alert. "You went down there, didn't you?" he asked. James didn't answer. He went straight to the hearth. The normal fire still burned, orange and alive. He stared at it a long while before finally saying, "That fire down there, it doesn't burn wood." The man frowned, confused. "Then what does it burn?" James looked at him, then at Max, whose golden fur glowed under the daylight streaming through the frosted window. "Memory," he said softly. "It burns what we leave behind." The man swallowed hard, as though the meaning hit deeper than he could explain. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow, soft, endless. James stood by the window, hand resting on Max's head, his scar glinting faintly in the cold light. The fire behind him crackled once, sending a small blue spark up the chimney that vanished into the white sky. A week passed before the storm cleared enough for the rescue chopper to reach the coordinates again. When the blades cut through the white silence, the pilot could hardly believe what he saw. A thin column of smoke rising from the endless snowfield, curling steady into the pale blue sky. "No way," he muttered. They landed a few hundred yards from the source, the snow untouched except for one faint trail leading to a small wooden cabin half buried beneath drifts. Captain Mark Rivers, heavy parka zipped to his chin, stepped out first, goggles reflecting the glare of the Arctic sun. "This can't be right," he said. The file in his pocket said the Harland cabin had been abandoned for a year. They had already held the memorial. As they approached, the snow gave way beneath their boots, revealing a solid crust of ice. Sarah Mills, the medic, pointed ahead. "Look, footprints!" They followed them up the small hill, and there it was. Smoke from the chimney, steady and grey, curling into the bright morning. Mark hesitated before knocking on the door. No sound. Then, faintly, a bark from inside. Low and familiar. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. The door creaked open slowly under the weight of frost. The sunlight flooded in, and for a moment, everything glowed gold. The cabin was warm. A fire burned in the hearth, its flames bright and alive. On the rug before it lay Max, the golden retriever, fur shining like honey, white patch on his chest glowing in the light. He lifted his head, tail wagging weakly, eyes calm and gentle. "Hey, boy." Mark knelt, his voice cracking. "You made it." He reached out a gloved hand, and Max pressed his nose into it, breathing softly. But where was the man? "Harland," Mark called, voice trembling. No answer. The bed was made, a cup of coffee half finished on the table. On the wall, above a weathered map, hung a faded photograph of James Harland. Smiling, arm around Max, both younger, both proud. "Captain," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the window. Footprints led out the back door, toward the ridge. They followed them, hearts pounding, but the tracks ended abruptly at the edge of a frozen stream. The snow there was melted, a perfect circle of warmth in the middle of the cold. Mark crouched, touched the surface. It was warm. "How's that possible?" he murmured. Behind them, Max barked once, sharp and clear, tail wagging as if greeting someone unseen. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke and pine. Sarah turned toward the horizon. For a moment, she swore she saw two figures walking across the white plain. One man in an olive jacket, slightly long curly silver-grey hair shining in the light. The other, a golden dog beside him, steps perfectly in sync. The vision shimmered like heat haze and vanished. "Did you see that?" she asked. Mark didn't answer. He only stared at the ridge, jaw tight, eyes glistening. "Yeah," he said softly. "I saw." They returned to the cabin. The logs in the fireplace burned slow and even, the warmth spreading through the room like a heartbeat. Mark sat down beside the fire, staring into the flames. He kept it going, he murmured. Sarah nodded quietly. On the table lay James's old brass lighter, its lid open, the inscription still clear. For those who never make it home. Beside it sat his dog tag, warm to the touch. Outside, the wind had gone still. Sunlight poured through the frosted window, washing over Max as he lay before the fire, eyes half closed, tail tapping the floor in slow rhythm. Content. When Sarah opened her mouth to say something, Mark stopped her. "Let him rest," he said softly. They left a small ration of food and water by the door, before stepping back into the light. As the helicopter rose, Mark looked down through the window and saw Max lift his head to watch them leave, framed by the orange glow of the eternal fire. He saluted, voice low. "Good boy." The chopper disappeared into the horizon. Below, the cabin stood silent again, smoke curling upward into the endless daylight, a small, warm heartbeat in the coldest place on earth.